All right, greetings, folks. My name is Tawfiq Haddad, and welcome to the webinar, Mapping the Future in British Mandate Palestine with Penny Sinanoglou. I hope I got that right. I'm going to just take a little bit of time for folks to get in the Zoom room, so to speak. It's also the call to prayer here in Jerusalem, and perhaps just as, well, no, forget about significance, but the main significance of this event is that it is taking place today on the 29th of November, which is the 75th anniversary of the UN Partition Plan issuance and vote of the UN Partition Plan on Palestine. So today we have a great lecture that's going to take on this subject and fill us all in. But actually, before we kick to Penny, I did want to say that today's lecture is hosted by the Council for British Research in the Levant and the Kenyan Institute in particular. We are broadcasting today from Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in Jerusalem. And this lecture is the 5th and final lecture in a series of lectures that we have run on the centenary year of the British Mandate in Palestine. So the British Mandate in Palestine was formally authorized by the League of Nations in the summer of 1922. And so this is the 100th year of that. And as I said, it is the 75th anniversary of the partition plan itself. Previous to this talk, we have done a very interesting series of lectures, attempting once again to try and have those coincide with historical dates. So we had an event around the issuance of the Balfour Declaration at the beginning of November. We had Matthew Hughes from Brunel University speak about the 1936 revolt and Britain's pacification of that. We had Gabriel Polly speaking about Victorians in Palestine. So please check out our website at cbrl.ac.uk, where you can find, we will be uploading all of those lectures that took place. And in addition to that, CBRL was also party to co-organizing another major 3-day conference with 5 other Palestine studies organizations on the question of reassessing the British Mandate in Palestine. We are also working to get those audio visual elements up on our website. That was 64 papers on the British Mandate. So it was a major intervention on the British Mandate, in addition to this talk and the other 4 that we mentioned. So we definitely have given it its space. And I must say as well that as being one of the people who co-organized it, as well as being a Palestine studies person myself to some extent, that you know, the field of Palestine studies and the study of the mandate is certainly becoming very much wider. There are more people in the game, and the level of stuff that they're researching is also, so qualitatively and quantitatively, we are seeing impressive interventions here. So without further ado, I want to get this webinar started. As I said, our speaker today is Penny Sinanoglou. Excuse me, Penny, my bad. Yes, so Penny Sinanoglou is an associate professor of history at Wake Forest University and a visiting associate professor at Pomona College. She's the author of Partitioning Palestine, British Policymaking at the End of the Empire, which came out from University of Chicago Press in 2019, and which won the 2020 Phi Alpha Theta Best First Book Award, and related articles and chapters in the Historical Journal and in edited volumes on 20th century partitions and the history of the British Empire in Palestine. Sinanoglou is broadly interested in the intersections between British imperial power and international systems of oversight and governance, the role of ethnicity, religion, gender, and nationality in imperial politics, and the changing legal status of imperial subjects in the colonial and post-colonial eras. She's currently writing a legal history of marriage in the 19th and 20th century British Empire. So fascinating, very much looking forward to hearing what she has to say. Unfortunately, I have not had a chance to read this book yet, but I will be making my notes on the side for questions. I will engage her after her presentation, which I understand is around 25 minutes long. But I also ask you to write down your notes, and when that comes around, that part of the webinar, please put your questions and answers in the question and answer feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we will get to them at the end of the after we hear from Dr. Sinanoglou. So without further ado, please, Penny, take it away. Looking forward.
Okay, let me share my slides.
Excellent, looks good.
Can you see?
Go ahead.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Go for it.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for being here. Greetings from Los Angeles, where it's 8 in the morning. So we're spanning sort of half the world, it seems, in our webinar. I'm delighted to be here with you, and I wanted to thank especially Dr. Tawfiq Haddad for the invitation to speak, and also Bisan Abu Aisha and Claire Halliday for all their work on the technical and administrative front. I appreciate all of that work. So in thinking about which themes to focus on for my part in a lecture series on the centenary of the British Mandate for Palestine, I was drawn to the notion of thinking across broad swaths of time. Here we are casting our glances backward a century. So I decided to concentrate my lecture on the ways in which British rulers of Palestine looked into the future, planning and projecting for the decades ahead of them. What motivated British policymaking in Palestine? And how did British imperial administrators envision the future? So we look backwards, and I want to look at them looking forwards. On the surface, of course, as you will remember, according to the text of the Mandate for Palestine, which incorporated the famous 1917 Balfour Declaration, about which, if you've attended previous lectures, you've heard, Great Britain was responsible for securing the establishment of an imprecisely defined Jewish national home. At the same time, Britain was charged with developing self-governing institutions in Palestine and protecting the civil and religious rights of all inhabitants, irrespective of race or religion. To many observers at the time, and to many analysts since, these two obligations were, practically speaking, incompatible. Jews were in a demographic minority, and the Arab majority was largely opposed to the establishment of any kind of Jewish national home in Palestine. In other words, if Britain instituted representative government, the nascent Jewish national home would almost certainly be destroyed. Of course, there were also those actors at the time, British and Zionist, who argued in various ways at different times that the obligations were not incompatible at all, either because the steps necessary to establish a Jewish national home did not in fact violate the civil and religious rights of all inhabitants of Palestine, or because they conceived of the national home as something that could be said to have been achieved at a particular moment, even if the Jews were a demographic minority. I think the so-called dual obligation as a British policy objective, or perhaps we might say a British sort of policy conundrum, is better known. Right? This is a fairly well-known story. So I wanted to dig a bit deeper and think about an additional driving motivation for British actions in Palestine, one that is, I think, exceedingly obvious, but that sometimes gets lost when we focus exclusively on the Zionist Arab struggle. And that, of course, is British imperial interest. The notion of dual obligations, and indeed of clashing obligations to Jews and Arabs, sometimes hides from view that Britain's actions in Palestine had to fulfill a different set of dueling obligations to Wilsonian ideals of self-determination and to British imperial interests in the region and globally. The former, of course, were loudly proclaimed in the League of Nations Charter and in the text of the Palestine Mandate, but the latter were concealed. On its face, the mandate was a burden generously borne by Britain on behalf of the world, an altruistic project whose aims were to serve as a midwife to a Jewish national home and a sovereign Palestine. In fact, in addition to the dual obligations to Jews and Arabs, there was a similar parallel tension between British obligations to the ideals of the League and to the needs of the empire. One place where we see this shadow set of dueling obligations being manifested is in long-range British plans for Palestine, and particularly in the cartographic and conceptual maps of the future that British planners drew up as they were faced by the 1930s with what appeared to be an intractable set of political problems. These maps, which I'm going to be showing you a little in a minute, offer a rich vein to be mined for insights into the relationships and tensions between planning and imagining and between imperialism and decolonization. The paths not taken, it seems to me, are as important for us to examine as those that eventually were taken, not just because they remind us as we look back from the vantage point of 100 years into a future that these administrators could not have foreseen, of the contingent quality of what eventually unfolded, but also because they act as a corrective to our tendency to read history backward, a phenomenon that is especially prevalent when looking at this part of the world, which still so preoccupies us. Partially, I think, because Britain ended up not having the kind of role so many officials had envisioned over the long term in Palestine, and because the map of what became Israel-Palestine looks so different from these 1930s maps, we tend to spend less time with these plans than we might if they had actually come to fruition. Revisiting them, however, can help us understand the Mandate period not only as an early stage of the Zionist-Arab conflict, which, to be clear, it was, but also as a late stage of British imperialism. So, before I dive into the maps of the 1930s, I do want to remind us of how deeply British imperial interests were involved in establishing Palestine and the Palestine Mandate in the first place. We can see Britain jockeying for territory in the Levant in the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, but in the period around 1919, despite the British military occupation of the territory that would come to compromise Palestine, it was not at all certain what Britain would get, territorially speaking, right? Indeed, in the summer of 1919, American President Woodrow Wilson sent the King-Crane Commission to travel through the Levant from as far south as Beersheba and up through Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, as far west as the line running roughly from Amman to Aleppo, and into the southeastern portion of Turkey as far as Mersinah, in order to discover, and here I'm quoting from their charge, the sentiments of the people of these regions with regards to the future administration of their affairs. The Syrian National Congress, under the leadership of Faisal ibn Hussein, called for what it termed Syria, quote, within its natural borders. Yet, and here we see, right, this is a sort of modern cartographic interpretation of that sort of greater Syria. And here we have a 1920 map of this sort of vision of a greater Syria, right? Yet on the map attached to the 1919 King-Crane Commission report, we see a Syria divided by competing claims, including the larger Palestine desired by the Zionists, as the commissioners put it in their report. Under the leadership of Chaim Weizmann, a Zionist Commission had been established in March 1918 to act as a body to study the situation in Palestine, make recommendations to the British authorities there, and negotiate with local leaders, including Faisal. Members of the Zionist Commission met with the King-Crane commissioners, and in the words of the commission report, abundantly supplied them with literature on Zionist wishes and plans. Eventually, of course, neither the Syrian National Congress nor the Zionist Commission saw their ideal maps put into effect, and instead, British strategic concerns, ranging from access to a deep water port on the Mediterranean and a critical gas line, to keeping France from expanding its influence southward from Syria, to crucial airfields in the region of the Suez Canal, came to shape the cartographic contours of Palestine. Wilsonian ideals were evident less on the map and more in mandate text, which paid lip service, at least, to the eventual self-government of the local population. As we all know, that eventual self-government appeared to recede further and further into the future as the 1920s and 1930s progressed. Violent unrest had plagued Palestine on and off since its creation. And in 1936, again, if you've attended the lecture, you'll know much more about this, the Arabs began a protracted multi-year uprising that strained British financial and military resources and threatened the image of the British Empire on the world stage. League of Nations oversight in Geneva meant that British officials had to answer increasingly uncomfortable questions about the lack of representative government in Palestine, especially after the admission of another British Middle East mandate, Iraq, to the League of Nations as an independent state in 1932. Starting with conversations and internal memoranda in the late 1920s, British officials increasingly turned to a variety of territorially based potential solutions, including cantonization and partition, as a way to solve the so-called Palestine problem. In 1936, during the Arab uprising, the British government sent a royal commission, commonly known as the Peel Commission, after its chairman, Lord Peel, to investigate the causes of and potential remedies for the unrest in Palestine. The maps produced from this moment forward provide us with an opportunity to explore Britain's visions of an imperial future in both its political and geographical manifestations. After months of hearing evidence and holding private meetings, the Peel Commission published its voluminous report in July of 1937, the central recommendation of which was that Palestine be partitioned into an Arab state in the south, to be joined with Transjordan, a Jewish state in the north, and, of particular interest for our purposes today, a new British mandatory area covering the holy cities of Jerusalem, Nazareth, and Bethlehem, Lake Tiberias, a corridor to Jaffa, a small enclave on the northwest coast of the Gulf of Aqaba, and for a time the so-called mixed towns of Haifa, Acre, Safed, and Tiberias as shown on this map. Critically, it also recommended the transfer of 225,000 Arabs and 1,250 Jews between the new states. Perhaps not surprisingly, the Peel Plan explicitly aimed at retaining British control over symbolic and geostrategic assets, such as Christian holy sites, airfields, military installations, and a deep water port in the Mediterranean. That's at Haifa. It mentioned preserving, quote, the security of the oil pipeline, unquote, and, quote, dealing with the maintenance of naval, military, and air forces, unquote. The British cabinet strongly backed the plan, despite public reactions ranging from ambivalence to outright opposition, and the League of Nations gave its tepid consent to further investigations into the possibility of partition. And I suppose it's appropriate in giving this talk today on the 75th anniversary of the UN vote, because these are the plans, these predate the UN vote obviously by a decade, but they are in some ways the basis for that partition map. A second set of maps were produced by the 1938 Woodhead Commission, sent to Palestine to research and propose a detailed partition plan. For a variety of reasons, in the months since the publication of the Peel Report, the British government had begun to sour on partition, and it indicated as much to the Woodhead commissioners. The new commission, not surprisingly therefore, came to no unanimous decision about how best to implement partition on the ground, returning with 3 possible plans, A, B, and C, shown here, none of which were endorsed by a true majority. 2 out of the 4 commissioners endorsed Plan C, which you'll note had the largest British mandated territory, and none of which were adopted as policy by the government. All 3 plans, however, continued to include British areas of control, ranging from continued mandatory territory to control of land sales, development, and a complex customs union between the Jewish and Arab states. In none of the plans, whether by the Peel or Woodhead commissions, was Britain removed from the map. Indeed, all the plans served instead to solidify a British presence in Palestine by making it temporally permanent while geographically more limited than it was under the present mandate. We might read these plans as attempts by British officials to fulfill the nested dual obligations, that is, to meet the technical expectations of the mandate in the form of nominally independent states that would establish a Jewish national home and a self-governing Arab Palestine, and simultaneously to maintain British geostrategic and religio-political interests in the territory on a permanent basis. In short, what these early plans proposed was less full decolonization and the establishment of independent states than the maintenance of imperial control through selective decolonization and continued intervention in successor states. One map, I think, takes this argument to its furthest extent, effectively arguing against any British withdrawal. This is a 1938 map hand-drawn by Charles Tegert entitled The D Plan of Partition. So it's humorously referencing the A, B, and C maps of Woodhead. And I'll come back to this. We'll look at it more closely in a minute. But let me tell you a little bit about Tegert. Tegert, an Irish Protestant who had started his career as a low-ranking policeman in Calcutta, rose through the ranks over 30 years, eventually becoming Chief Commissioner of Police in Bengal. In the middle of the Arab uprising of 1936 to 39, he was seconded to Palestine, where he was tasked with fixing what by then was clearly a broken intelligence and policing system. And it was towards the end of his secondment that he drew this map. Tegert's D plan divides British Mandate Palestine into 19 states, enclaves, unions, and other assorted spaces. Though I'm afraid that nothing kills a joke faster than explaining it, dissecting the humor of the map helps demonstrate the links between the Tegert, Woodhead, and Peel plans and Peel maps, and highlights the sort of imperial futures in all of them. Although I have referred to Tegert's map as a sketch map, it seems clear that the outline of Palestine's borders was traced from a printed source. Tegert is also careful to follow the cartographic conventions used to distinguish between those borders established by nature, the solid line of the Mediterranean coast, and those invented by man, the dotted lines of Palestine's international border, its internal divisions, and the anti-illegal immigration boundary at sea. Tegert's use of traced contours and standardized mapping practices instantly provides the map with an authoritative foundation, and yet the map's content is imagined and humorous, thus blurring the line, as it were, between received geospatial knowledge and invented geopolitical humor. Other elements of the map further destabilize the boundary between mapping and mocking. Some of the labeled spaces mirror those found on the Peel and Woodhead partition maps, such as Arab and Jewish states and mandated territories. As with those maps, Tegert's map includes oddly situated states and a corridor. These elements establish Tegert's map in a serious conversation about partition. Grounded in some semblance of reality, Tegert's map then utilizes cartographic absurdity to demonstrate the futility of earlier partition maps. Tegert's square, oval, triangular, and banded spaces are neat and regular, whereas the Peel and Woodhead maps have virtually no straight lines. And yet the sheer proliferation of rational yet unrealistic shapes on the Tegert map causes the viewer to return to the Woodhead maps in particular, and to realize the absurdity of the tortuous maze of enclaves, corridors, and tiny territories within tiny territories. And maybe it's worth going back for a second just to remind you how many tiny territories and sort of oddly shaped areas are in the Woodhead maps. Okay. The Tegert D plan similarly plays with the absurd to shine light on geopolitical realities. In addition to by now standard Jewish, Arab, and mandated areas, Tegert's map includes a preserve for ex-members of commissions, of which by this time there had been over a dozen in Palestine, and a large space, incidentally including some of the more fertile and hotly contested land, labeled "this space free for advertising." The darker side of Tegert's humor is evident in the area reserved for Assyrians, who had been massacred in Iraq in 1933 following Britain's withdrawal from the Mandate, and in the rectangular area labeled German and Italian spheres of influence. These remind the viewer that partition plans are not just about Palestine, but also about other international and imperial political interests, and that mapping has sometimes deadly effects. The uncanny resonance of the Tegert map with the Peel and Woodhead maps raises a broader question. Are the Peel and Woodhead maps really plans? That is, are they serious policy proposals, or are they exercises in imperial imagination, meant to identify the border between the politically pragmatic and the geopolitically possible? Might cartographic absurdity constitute an important element of British imperial politics? Primed by Tegert's humor, we see the overlap between the absurd and the serious as we turn to the Peel partition map, whose minuscule corridor ensuring British access to the deep water port at Haifa is at its narrowest point as wide as the mile-thick red line of partition. We might therefore read this map as questioning rather than simply advocating partition, for it demonstrates the impossibility of a partition that both fulfills political and strategic imperatives and achieves cartographic and geographic coherence. Tegert was well known for his abilities in counterterrorism in Bengal and for his record in disrupting terrorist networks and surviving multiple assassination attempts. He and his colleague David Petrie, who had served in criminal intelligence in India and was later instrumental in organizing and developing an Indian overseas intelligence network, which he ran undercover from Shanghai, eventually presented a report to the Palestine government recommending a major reorganization of the police force, including vastly improved training, language skills, infrastructural upgrades, and better pay and benefits. Tegert also planned and oversaw the construction of a barbed wire fence along Palestine's northern border, punctuated with small police forts whose design derived from the small fortifications of the northwest frontier provinces in India. This fence was designed to keep out men in arms coming into Palestine over the Syrian border. More than 50 Tegert forts, large fortified police stations, were built following Tegert's recommendation, and many of these still stand today, including this one at Latrun, overlooking the Jerusalem to Tel Aviv highway. Over the course of Tegert's time coordinating internal security measures, the incidence of urban terrorist acts fell. By the time he left Palestine, the army had successfully put down the Arab revolt. In other words, the man who sketched out the D plan of partition was not some sort of upstart or disgruntled petty functionary. He was high-ranking and powerful in ways that left a mark not just on paper, but also on the very landscape of Palestine and to this day. My sense is that Tegert, whose home country, Ireland, was partitioned much to his dismay when he was in his early 30s, drew this map not to undermine British political imperial power, but rather to call for its reassertion. A world governed by political expediency rather than by British imperial power is a world of 19 territories crammed into an area the size of Wales. As is evidenced by his professional activities, Tegert would rather carpet Palestine in police and fortresses than fragment it. Though the Tegert map is obviously satirical, I would suggest that its dark humor can help us read the Peel and Woodhead maps and highlight the imperial futures embedded within them. These maps, all of them, not only inscribe a British imperial presence on Palestine explicitly through the existence of planned British enclaves, corridors, and other areas of control, but also they use cartographic absurdity as a way of undermining and invalidating the creation of new independent states. In this way, even something like the Peel map, which proposed a radically shrunken British footprint in Palestine, in fact envisions a British imperial future in Palestine. Charged with maintaining a 19th century version of imperial power in an era of Wilsonian ideals, perhaps it's not surprising that partition's architects came up with plans on paper that, though presented seriously, seem shot through with a sense of the ridiculous. Here, for instance, is Reginald Copeland, the major author of the Peel Report, elaborating on that narrow corridor. The Arab town of Jaffa, he explains, would be surrounded by strips of mandated land, and the plan would require, and here I'm quoting, a belt of parkland with railings and a road running north and south through each belt, with gates at each end. There would also be roads running east and west between the enclave and the sea, unquote. The Woodhead Commission later modified this proposal, offering instead the plan to construct a straight road dividing Jaffa and Tel Aviv with a, quote, high iron railing running down the middle, complete with gates to allow the passage of traffic between the two towns. Given that both commissions were sent to Palestine in the wake of significant bloodshed, and that by 1938, Britain was otherwise occupied militarily, one begins to wonder whether the railing between dark humor and earnest planning isn't similarly porous. So what role does dark humor play in imperial planning at this point in time? I'd like to venture in conclusion that absurdity, fairly hidden in the Peel map, emerging in the Woodhead maps, and finally fully revealed in Tegert's map, is the ultimate rhetorical weapon against decolonization. Remember that these maps are produced when a Wilsonian language of self-determination is being deployed by subject peoples, not to mention that this language is finally being backed up with weapons, in this particular case, Jews and Arabs in Palestine, And British representatives are also speaking that language, particularly at the League of Nations in Geneva. At the same time, especially in the later 1930s, as the European situation looks more and more dire, the geostrategic needs of the empire are brutally clear. The Tegert, Woodhead, and Peel maps demonstrate in no uncertain terms that to offer the clamoring parties what they so fervently desire, that is, independence and territorial sovereignty, while at the same time maintaining British territorial interests in Palestine, is impossible without sacrificing geographic and cartographic coherence. In essence, these maps are less about partition than they are about decolonization, about the geographical demands and limits of British power, and about how utterly unimaginable, how unthinkable, irrational, and absurd a post-imperial world is for these planners. In the contest of obligations between British imperial strategic interests and Wilsonian ideals of self-determination, British planners, whether in jest or in earnest, mapped a future for Palestine that served the British Empire. Thank you.
Penny, you've just been listening to Penny Sinanoglou, who just presented on the issue of partitioning Palestine, British policymaking at the end of empire. A fascinating talk, Penny. So I'm going to engage you with a couple of questions, but I'm also going to remind folks in the audience to put their questions in the chat. As I said previously, Penny, like I did not have the chance to actually read this book beforehand because I couldn't get a copy around locally. With that said, I was struck by how these maps evidence that all along the initial, how to say, the promise of the Balfour Declaration, so to speak, that, you know, this talk is coming from East Jerusalem, right? And if you go to Ramallah, just 18 kilometers up the road, you will see posters that are up there with a picture of Balfour with a big X on it, okay? Yeah. Which basically, you know, till today, more than 100 years later, are saying Balfour is the cause of our suffering today or whatnot, okay? So they see the British as basically having given Palestine to the Zionists and promised it to the Jews, so to speak, okay? Now, we can understand where that comes from, but your research is also saying, to some extent, if I'm not mistaken, that there, I mean, it's also very difficult to inscribe teleology and linearity, shall we say, but you're implying that the British functionally and in secret basically held to the idea that neither the Jews nor the Arabs would be really benefiting from Palestine. This was always really going to be British-held mandatory territory, correct?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, it's interesting. I don't know how secret it is that that Britain has, you know, clear reasons for being in Palestine that have nothing to do with the Zionist Arab conflict. You know, this is from the perspective of a British imperial historian, which, to be clear, that's where I'm coming at this from. I suppose I ended up in this history really in some ways from the perspective of British imperial history, and from the perspective of British imperial history, Palestine is another territory, right? You maybe heard a little bit in the talk, right, that some of the connections, and they're fleshed out more in the book, between Palestine, Ireland, India. There are connections that I find to territories in Africa. So British imperial administrators are looking at Palestine for its geostrategic importance. You know, whether that's oil, whether that's air, you know, RAF airfields, a deep water port on the Mediterranean, that's huge. I mean, that's a central point of negotiation between the British and the French, is basically about ports and about oil and oil pipelines and access to oil fields. I mean, this is part of the negotiations after World War I, and the eventual Treaty of Sèvres that breaks up the Ottoman Empire. So I think it's recognizing that the Zionist Arab conflict is important. It's part of the story, but it's not the entire story, and that the British are navigating a larger set of colonial interests, right? Why is Palestine important for them? Partially symbolically, Christian holy sites, some sense of sort of being a protector of Christians in the Holy Land. But you can't ignore its strategic place on the Mediterranean, the sort of Levantine coast, the proximity to the Suez Canal. So yeah, I think it's, part of what I'm trying to do is get us to think, yes, so the Zionist Arab conflict grows up under an imperial umbrella, right? And although the Zionist state, the Zionist para-government grows up in some ways under the protection of an imperial power, it also, as everybody knows, when that becomes inconvenient, when that alliance, when that Zionist-British alliance becomes inconvenient, they go their separate ways, right? And we certainly, one of the things that I was really struck by when I first started doing research in the archives is the degree to which British officials are surprised, they're struck in 1936 by the fact that the Arab uprising is directed not just against Jews, but against British forces. And similarly, there's a kind of shock and dismay when Zionist operatives start attacking British forces after World War II. So I think we do see this sort of separation of British interests from either Arab or Zionist ones.
But how would you explain how England or not England, excuse me, Great Britain or UK imagined being able to control what were very clearly, potent nationalisms, and of course, to some extent, in the case of the Zionists, they were actually training and facilitating this, and they also were very aware that there were people who were also fighting with them, and were part of the RAF and everything else, right?
Yeah. I think, one way of thinking about this is to remember that, when the Balfour Declaration comes out in 1917, and even when the mandate is set up, and even the sort of terms of the mandate from the 1920s and those early years of the mandate, I think it's important to remember, number one, we know, but they didn't know what's going to happen in Germany in the 30s and how things are going to develop in Eastern Europe across the 1930s. It's important to remember that until 1933, 1934, there's more Jewish outmigration from Palestine than there is in-migration. This is not a terribly attractive place for people to move, right? It's malarial, it's an inhospitable landscape. They don't have the necessary skills. This is not, there are some ideological attractions, but this is not an incredibly popular or terribly attractive place for people to move to. So, the statistics that we have are that, yes, people will come and then they will leave again. So I think it's important to remember that, because it's clear that British administrators, nobody foresees what's going to happen in the later 30s, right? It's very difficult to put the project, the cat is out of the bag. It's very difficult to turn the ship around by the 1930s, although remember, the British do try. The 1939 white paper is their attempt at basically shutting this whole thing down. But I think, initially, it makes sense as a sort of British imperial strategic plan. It's a form of and I hope this isn't too controversial to say, but from a British imperial historian's perspective, this looks really familiar as a case of settler colonialism. It's just in this case, most of the settlers are not British, and some of them are not English speaking, but the British Empire has a lot of experience in moving people, small groups of settlers from place to place in order to control territory. And it's never, it's always a question for the British Empire. What's the balance between the utility of those settlers and then the things that they demand? That happens across the British Empire. It happens in Africa, right? It happens in Australia and Canada. So this is something that the British Empire kind of has experience managing.
Thank you for these insights. Very I think in the din, so to speak, of the contending rhetoric and what's dominant today, this perspective is actually very much lost. So it's very much appreciated. Thank you, Penny. Yesterday I was reading the Israeli news, and they were talking about that Yediot Ahronot had said that they found the audio recording of the partition plan vote, and so. On the occasion before this, I said, let's listen to this audio recording. And I can't remember, there are only around 50 to 60 different countries who were only voting on partition in the end. And at a certain point, the United Kingdom comes up for the vote. And I tell you, as a Palestine scholar, and I'm open to expose my ignorance of this, the United Kingdom actually abstains on the partition plan vote, and everything you've said today basically explains that. So I would love to hear if you could add a little bit more insight on this. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. That's such a fascinating moment, right? Because one of the things that's happening from February of 1947, when Britain basically announces, look, we've hit a dead end. We can't, we've tried all of these negotiations. We've tried all of these conferences. We can't get anybody to agree on anything. We're basically turning the mandate over, the question of the mandate over to the United Nations as a successor organization to the League. And Britain basically says, we can't manage this anymore, and we are going to remove ourselves from the situation unilaterally, right? And it's fascinating because you see that coming out in the partition vote with that abstention, where they're saying, we are actually not going to be involved anymore, right? We're not going to put our thumb on the scale. We're not going to do, we're not going to weigh in any significant way. The reality is that partition plan, that is the UN partition plan, has its roots, not just, and I'm not just saying this conceptually, it has its roots in these British partition plans of the 1930s, but it also has its roots literally, like we know the papers that went. I mean, there's a man, Douglas Harris, who is a water engineer from India who was seconded to Palestine in the 1930s, and he works on the partition plans. I mean, he is the key sort of person who works on partition plans with Copeland and the Peel commissioners, and he continues to be the point person on partition. And Douglas Harris works with UNSCOP, right? He passes all these papers through. He types up huge reports on the history of partition planning, the history of sort of territorial solutions for the Palestine problem, and passes those over to the UN authorities. So that British abstention is a public renunciation of involvement, even as there is deep involvement in the actual partition planning. So I think that's a really fascinating moment.
Indeed. Thank you for explaining that. So I have one more question, a bit to do with your own motivations as well as your methodology around that. But before I ask you to answer it, folks have begun to put their questions in the question and answer feature. Please do that. We've got a great discussion going here. So Penny, your own thoughts on what were your motivations around this, and how did you methodologically go about this study?
Sure. My motivations, I guess, a little bit of like intellectual genealogy. I was, as an undergraduate, was this was a Columbia Middle Eastern and Asian Languages and Cultures, as it was called at the time, major, and then sort of fell back into European history, which was my first love in high school. And I started to obviously work on the space where they sort of intersected in the colonial world. And when I started graduate school, I think in my first semester, I was in a seminar on sort of early 20th century British history. We were reading something on World War I, and there was a footnote about the decommissioned World War I soldiers, the so-called Black and Tans, who suppressed the Irish uprising around the time of the Irish partition. And then it's sort of in an offhand way mentioned like, and then they were shipped off to Palestine. And I thought, that's interesting, right? So this project in some ways sort of grew out of that footnote, right? My question in a way was like, what connected these places? Partition, obviously, counterinsurgency warfare, but then I started to see also that the movement of personnel across the empire often drew together Palestine, India, Ireland. I got really interested in those sort of circuits of knowledge and circulation of imperial expertise. And I guess, for me, one of the really fascinating things was how the story shifts, or how our perspective shifts on the Zionist Arab conflict if we put it in the framework of the British Empire. And I recognize that's upsetting to some people. I get a fair amount of pushback because it disrupts the exceptionalism of this story, that, Zionism is another nationalist project. And to some extent, this looks like other forms of British settler colonialism. And, similarly, sort of Palestinian disenfranchisement is not particularly unique, right? It's something that you see kind of across the British imperial world. So it's been interesting for me to sort of move between the fields of British imperial history, where basically people don't talk about the Middle East because British imperial history is all about India, and maybe a bit about Africa. So it's a little peripheral there. And then to move into sort of Middle Eastern history or Palestinian studies or Israel studies. And people say like the British Empire, why are we talking about the British Empire? So I think I've gotten a lot out of bringing these literatures together. And so methodologically, yeah, I mean, I do the work that historians do, which is basically I've become an archives rat, and dug through it. One fascinating piece of this story is that, some of the archives of the British Mandatory Administration did make it back to London, but some didn't. And so I understand these archives are now closed, or they're undergoing some sort of digitization. But when I was working on the book, the Israel State Archives were a fantastic place to go through tons of sort of administrative paperwork of mandatory administration. And then, yeah, I mean, the Tegert stuff is in Oxford. I just sort of followed my nose and followed threads to the personal papers of various administrators and commissioners, and tried to sort of reconstruct their worldviews. So. Taufik, I think you're muted.
Oh, yikes, I was. And I was saying fascinating. I was singing your praises, and it was all to nobody. Anyway, no, fascinating. Thank you for your input and your insight on both what you've done as well as, how you did it as well. I'm going to transition now to some of the questions that have popped up. So
Yeah.
again, audience members, write them down. But we have some good questions straight off the bat, starting with Harrison Potter, who asks, is it possible to assess how Tegert's work in his previous post before he went to Palestine shaped his views towards ethnic and religious conflicts specifically? Did he institute similar policies throughout his work in both his previous posts and in Palestine? Thank you for the question, Harrison.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, I mean, we have a lot of material, and I did track some of Tegert's material back to India. I spent some time in the archives in Delhi, which was really interesting. And again, I was trying to get a perspective on Palestine from India, right? And to sort of see like what is the chatter like among British officials in India about what's going on in Palestine. And so yes, there is. Tegert is coming from an imperial space that is already very much engaged in thinking about sectarian conflict, right? And where British imperial officials have already utilized territorial partition to try to manage sectarian conflict and also to sort of utilize it, I suppose. Between 1905 and 1911, Britain partitions part of India basically to sort of hamper ethno-religious political movements. And so, yes, I think it's incredibly significant that Tegert's coming from India, and that he already has ways of thinking about sectarian conflict and that the interconnectedness of sectarian conflict and space, right? And how to sort of manage space, how to set up dragnets, how to set up dividing lines, fences, as I mentioned, sort of on the fly, right? The barbed wire fence and the Tegert forts he's brought. I mean, those are techniques of surveillance and separation that he brings from the sort of so-called lawless areas of the Northwest frontier provinces in India. And he does think in a very particular way about Muslims, and about kind of this like pan-Islamic threat to the British Empire, and how it can be controlled. So yes, there's definitely continuity across his posting in India, and then in Palestine. That's a great question.
Thank you. Next question on the list is from Yair Hakak, who compliments you, saying, a very interesting talk. Thank you. Can I ask you?
I have to say hi to Yair because we went to college together.
Oh, you exposed him. All right. I don't know him. Okay. But thank you, Yair, for your question. So he gives you a big compliment. Very interesting talk. And can I ask you to elaborate a little bit about the motives of various different actors inside the British colonial establishment? Yeah. I ask because on Tegert's map, I see, quote,
the preserve for ex-members. Yeah.
Preserve for ex-members of commissions, end quote. Preserve. It's misspelled here. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. And it continues, which would seem to imply that he's mocking his counterparts in the colonial establishment who might be less, quote, clear-eyed, unquote, than a colonial anti-terrorist policeman, ...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a great question, and it highlights, I feel like I'm always telling my students this, we say in shorthand, like Britain did this, Britain did that, Britain wanted blah, blah, blah. And I'm always saying, who, like what, who are we talking about? Who is Britain? Britain is not a person. So yes, I mean, I think what Yair's question raises really rightly is that there's conflict within the colonial establishment, right? That there are different interests at play. And yeah, sometimes the motives are clashing. I mean, Tegert is a great example, right? He's basically brought in to shake things up. He's brought in because the Arab revolt is, spiraling out of control. Nobody seems able to kind of put a lid on it. And he's seen to have this great sort of counterterrorism experience and policing experience. So yeah, some of the reactions to his reforms from imperial administrators are, they don't like what he's doing. It's too expensive. It's too disruptive to their established order. I would say, there's also clashing interests between, roughly speaking, a lot of the sort of lower level functionaries on the ground, district commissioners, assistant district commissioners, right? People who are really embedded in their sort of local areas and local communities. They tend to, depending on where they are, they will sometimes be more sympathetic to the sort of Arab position. And then you'll have, their directors, whether that's in Jerusalem or in London, who are more committed to the Jewish National Home Project. So there are clashes within British imperial administration. And there are even when you just look back at London, there's kind of infighting over the direction of policy between members, say, of the Colonial Office and of the Foreign Office, right? As they jockey for control, who gets to decide on policy in this part of the Middle East? And one of the concerns is, those people who look at Palestine in isolation and are sort of focused on policy for Palestine in and of itself may want to move in one direction. And those who are looking at the wider Arab world, this is especially true of the Foreign Office, when they're looking at the wider Arab world, when they're looking at kind of Muslim opinion, this is where the work that I did in India came in, they're really concerned. They're saying, look, yeah, you guys, this is not about Palestine. This is about the entire Middle East. This is actually about our roots to India. This is about the Muslim populations in India, and they're being inflamed by what's going on in Palestine. So they have a very different set of interests. So yes, I think it's important to recognize the degree to which British policymaking is conflicted within the political establishment. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, if I might add there, though, the way you tended to parse the different opinion makers had to do with, if I'm not mistaken, you said the Foreign Office and the Colonial Office, and then you also talked about which part of the food chain they're on, to some extent. But you did not try to link that back to anything that was a bit more, ideological, or even to have it reflect back upon your initial dichotomy that you mentioned about Wilsonian idealism and realist realpolitik of how to manage an empire or whatever.
Yeah. I don't see it. I'll be honest, I don't see a ton of Wilsonian idealism being articulated by most actors in private. Certainly when these, when these officials have to go to Geneva and answer questions, right? And they're answering often very difficult questions. I mean, this was the other framework, which I didn't get into in the talk as much at all, actually. I think it was I just didn't have the chance. But the other framework in which to see Palestine, it's not just a part of the British Empire, it's a weird part of the British Empire, it's a League of Nations mandate. And, one of my research questions was like, well, what difference does it make that Palestine is a League of Nations mandate? I mean, you can read, there's tons of historiography on the Zionist Arab conflict that doesn't mention at all the fact that this is a League of Nations mandate, that there are annual meetings in Geneva where, officials are being grilled, like, what's going on? Why is there no legislative council? What are the moves towards independence? Especially as we move through the 30s, once Iraq has gained its, very nominal, I won't get into that, but it's right. At least on paper, Iraq is independent. It becomes a League member state. This shows up the gaps in Palestine tremendously. And so, yes, when British officials are in Geneva, they kind of are speaking this language of national self-determination. When they are planning, when they are writing minutes to each other, when they are conversing, like when we have kind of the internal communications, they're thinking about that only in as much as it's a public relations problem on the world stage. Their primary concern is, how do we maintain what Britain needs in this territory, right?
Right. Okay. Well, thank you. We have one more question, and that's the last question in the question and answer. So if you have more questions, throw them in there. This one comes from Martin OKane, who says the following: with regards to Tegert's Irish background, I'm not sure that his Irish experience caused him to, quote, dismay at the prospect of partition. If he came from the Unionist community of Northern Ireland, which always supported partition in Ireland, in 1916 to 1922, surely he then would have supported partition of different religious/ethnic communities in Palestine. Thoughts?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. He is we do have some of his writings on Ireland, and he is yes, he is an Irish Protestant, but he is not supportive of partition. He's a unionist, absolutely, but he would like all of Ireland to be a part of the United Kingdom. He is horrified at the partition. He is horrified at the violence that it sort of unleashes, and I suppose this is his sort of law and order background. He writes about, his thought is basically that had the uprising been suppressed more stringently, none of this would have been necessary, right? So that's his perspective on partition.
Which uprising? I'm sorry.
Sorry, the Irish uprising.
Irish, right? Okay.
Yeah. That I mean, that basically had the Easter Rising was crushed, and had the war, the 1919 to sort of 1921 war been fought more, with greater strength on the part of British forces, all of Ireland would have remained within the United Kingdom.
Right. Well, Penny, Dr. Sinanoglou, excuse me, it's been a fascinating conversation. We have no more questions. We just came up on an hour, and I think I'm very happy to, stop there and point folks to your book. As I said, it is called Partitioning Palestine, British Policymaking at the End of the Empire, and came out from University of Chicago Press in 2019. So perhaps was a bit overshadowed by COVID, but we are very happy to have you speak with us today as the 5th lecture on our series on the centenary of the mandate. Thank you so much once again. Folks, check out our website. We will put this up together with all the other stuff on the centenary of the mandate. And otherwise, check out our website, cbrl.ac.uk. And thanks once again, Dr. Sinanoglou.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Good night from Jerusalem. All the best.